Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems that surprisingly, the Minister has run out of things to say on his budget, but we've got plenty still on this side of the House to add to the discussion on this bill. Look, the Labour Party does support the bill that we're debating now, and it would, of course, it would be crazy if we didn't. It is in part goes some way to acknowledging what Best Start was trying to do, but as we've debated at great length, it certainly doesn't go all the way and on some critical areas. Probably, even though there is a stark contrast between the two packages in terms of scale, in terms of length, probably our biggest disappointment is still the exclusions that exist for families. And we traversed at quite a lot of detail the fact that there's those who are our most vulnerable are excluded, but actually there are a group of middle New Zealanders, for want of a better word, who are also excluded. Mr. Speaker, in this budget, the government used quite a bit of rhetoric around vulnerable children in the speech that Mr. English gave yesterday. In particular, the government announced some extra funding for the vulnerable, to basically implement the Vulnerable Children's Bill. Now, that actually did need to happen. We have an agenda by Paula Bennett that actually was going fairly underfunded, actually, in the way that it was being rolled out. 2 children's teams are already in existence, and just to give some context, children's teams are collaborative, cross-sectoral teams that are meant to work with our most vulnerable children in areas where there is that extra need. So we had 2 pilot sites in Rotorua and in Whangarei, and as of November last year, they were working with a total of 32 children. 32 children were being assisted by the government's children's teams. Now, we always agreed that they were a good idea. What we disagreed with was the fact that they were having to operate out of a department's baselines. It was just untenable. And so it is good to see that there's some extra funding going in there. It needed to happen if we're going to make some inroads. But also, the government did make a bit of a statement around the fact that they were supporting vulnerable children, not just through this package we're discussing today, but through $349 million going into child protection. Now, that is up from 2008, 2009. Child protection services then were getting roughly $317 million. But if you inflation adjust it, actually what SIFs need to be awarded just to keep pace with inflation is more like $360 million. They're still falling shy. And that's taking into account that over that period of time, we've gone from 49,000 notifications where further actions required by Child, Youth and Family, up to 61,800. Big jump in the number of cases that need Child, Youth and Families' attention, and a big jump in the number that are substantiated. So yes, the government has put social workers in specific places, in hospitals, in our schools, but on the front line they really are still an ambulance. And it was always intended, actually, that Child, Youth and Family did have a preventative role, but that is long gone. That is long gone. And so I want to compare that then, Mr. Chair, to what Labor has proposed with Best Start, because what was clear in the debate, where there was comparison between the package of what the government has put forward here in income measures and what Labor has put forward, is that Best Start was never just about income. Yes, that was a big part of it. We had, as part of it, 26 weeks paid parental leave. We had a Best Start payment that reached 95% of families. The only families excluded from our Best Start payment were those earning over $150,000. That was where we were happier to put our exclusion zone. The government put theirs on people earning less than roughly $20,000. Stark contrast in the way that we address those packages. So we had roughly 95% of families being covered by our package, so a big difference there. But the government, when it was talking about its payment package, which is in this bill, it did talk about wanting to balance the issue of giving options to families but also maintaining a parent's attachment to the workplace. Now, we can sit and try and play around with what that might look like using tables and spreadsheets and options, or we can actually use the evidence. Some of the best evidence we have is now coming through from the Growing Up in New Zealand study, which uses a diverse cohort of approximately 7,000 families in New Zealand and is covering their experiences in raising their children. So the last time we did this was with the Dunedin study, the longitudinal study. Yes, they're expensive studies to do, but they provide us with such rich data, and they provide policymakers with a bit of a sense over the choices parents are making, sometimes even when they're up against strong financial pressure. So what we do know from the Growing Up in New Zealand study, where children were born in 2009, so we're some way down the track now with those families, is that 11% of the children in the study live in households with an income of less than $30,000 per annum. 11% are in poverty, in extreme poverty. Then in that regard, or could be considered to be in quite deprivation. So John Hayes just said rubbish. I can't quite tell which element of what I just said was rubbish. Does he think that you're not struggling if you're raising a family on $30,000 maybe? Is that the point he's trying to make? Or does he not acknowledge that 11% are growing up in those circumstances? He has nothing further to add. So that's what we know about those families. So there are a significant number who are really in quite significant deprivation. Then if we continue to look over it, the study also found that 40% of families had received the paid parental leave over the last year, and a smaller percentage had received family tax credits. Now that's interesting. So actually that sits with what we've talked about today, that a large number of people aren't eligible for paid parental leave, which is being extended in this bill by 4 weeks. And actually people do tend to miss out on things like the parental tax credit, which we've also been debating. And that actually 18% of the families had at some point during that period been reliant on a government benefit. 18%. Those families get nothing from this bill. Those 18% of families get absolutely nothing from this bill today, and that is a point we've tried to make very, very strongly. But here's another interesting fact. Of all of the families, they were actually reliant on a great number of income sources during the first 9 months of their child's life. Only, and this is incredible, only 14% received income from only one source. So this traditional idea that one parent goes out and keeps working and the other stays home and cares for the child, not so. It's just a luxury for families now. Only 14% received income from only one source. 38% received income from 2 sources. 31% from 3 sources. And for 5% of families and 13% of families, they went from 4 sources or more. And 5% were having to try and cobble together an income from 5 sources. So that's families working multiple jobs, trying to bring in enough income to be able to survive with their new child. And that's over the first 9 months of a child's life. Keep that in mind. So what kind of situation does that create for those families? Now, the government said that what they wanted to do with paid parental leave was maintain attachment to the workforce. I'm afraid that simplifies down the situation to say that actually a mother's only choice is whether or not, Mr. Speaker, is whether or not she holds on in a slightly lesser income for a longer period. Actually, some of these parents are just having to make the choice to go back in order to keep the income high enough to keep going. And then we see that from that data. And this one final point from this study. The types of leave taken during the first 9 months were made up of paid parental leave, unpaid leave and annual leave. Families are cobbling together what they can to stay home longer, and I think that's really telling. But as I said in the beginning, Best Start, and there have been a lot of comparisons between Labour's package and National's, was never just about income. It was also about doing things like putting a boost into early childhood education. We want to move from 20 free hours for families to 25 free hours. We want to fund ECEs so that all of their staff can be 100% fully qualified and that they're funded to do that. We want to put a boost into Plunket so that Plunket nurses can be not only a universal service but a targeted one, where we're putting them into the homes earlier of our most vulnerable families and keeping them there longer. That's what we want to do to create that extra support that's not just about financial support, but support in raising a child for families that sometimes have very little outside support themselves. And in health, We listened to the excellent work that was led by Paul Hutchison and the Health Select Committee. We want there to be 10-week gestational checks. We want free scans for mums, and we want free antenatal classes. All of that, Mr Chair, is how you give a child a best start in life, and that is what Labor would do.
Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise and speak to the third reading of these two